Okay, why don't we get started? So I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today as we present this webinar on the Federal Plastics Registry. If you do have any questions that come to mind during the presentation, please feel free to type the question into the chat, or everyone is currently muted, but you can unmute yourself when the question period comes at the end and ask the question verbally. Just want to let everyone know we are recording this presentation. So probably within the week or so, we will have it available through our social portals on our company blog. All right, presenting today. So we have myself. My name is Michael Schutte. I'm a senior client manager and key account manager leader. We also have Timothy Reyes. Tim is our team lead for the ventilation engineering service line, and we both represent the emissions reduction and compliance group at Pinchin. And here's the agenda for today's session. So we're going to do a brief background on the Federal Plastics Registry. We'll also talk about the reporting obligations for the registry. Specifically, we'll take a look at the impact on Canadian companies. So seeing as we are nearing the phase 1 reporting deadline, that's going to be the main focus of this webinar today. We will touch a little bit on phase 2 reporting, and we do plan to have a part 2 webinar as we get closer to that deadline. We'll also do a brief little interactive demo of a screening tool that we have developed to help identify whether or not a client is required to report to phase 1. And then we will go through the next steps and then that question period, as I mentioned earlier. So why was the Federal Plastics Registry created? Environment Canada has created this reporting obligation to support the very ambitious goal of eliminating plastic waste by 2030. So to achieve this, they need to track plastic from manufacturing, use, and disposal throughout its life cycle. So the ask for companies is to report on the quantity manufactured, imported, and placed on the market annually. As I mentioned the previous slide, we do have a section that we will demo that screening tool that I will highlight. And within that tool, we also have definitions for specific terms that Environment Canada uses within the regulation. So we'll provide some insights on that. So things like, the terminology placed on the market, for example. So through a multi-phased approach, reporting will be required based on the 2024, 2025, and 2026 years data. Submissions will be made via the Environment Canada's online ECCC platform. And the first reporting deadline, which is for phase 1, is right around the corner here. That is due on September 29th of 2025. Now, we get to answer the question of why must you report? Well, basically because it is mandatory for Environment Canada and it will be enforced. You can see on this slide, large companies can face significant penalties for non-compliance that can hit $500,000, with fine limits doubling for each subsequent offense, which, given our experience, it's actually quite high by environmental enforcement standards. So there's definitely motivations to be filling out this reporting. And then specifically, some individuals can face fines of up to $25,000. So I wanted to just provide a brief little snapshot of the timeline for the Federal Plastics Registry. And you can see the reporting for this registry is phased out through a 3-year period, obviously starting phase one, September 29th, 2025, and further expanded. So as I mentioned, reporting is being phased in gradually. Phase one covers the 2024 data and focuses primarily on packaging, single-use plastics, and electronics with plastic components. Again, that deadline is right around the corner. That's September 29th, 2025. In phase two, more product categories are added. Things like resins, textiles, construction plastics, tires, etc. And then we'll see in phase three and phase four, expanding to full life cycle reporting. This will include waste fate data, like how much is recycled, landfilled, or incinerated. And this stepwise rollout really should give companies a good amount of time to prepare. I'll now pass this off to my colleague Tim, who will take over on the reporting obligations.
Thanks, Mike. So, as Mike mentioned, the Federal Plastics Registry is a mandatory reporting requirement. And who exactly has to report? Essentially, it's anybody in the industry that manufactures or imports plastic resins. If you're a producer of plastic packaging or products, if your facility falls under industrial, commercial, or institutional, and it generates plastic waste, which is almost all of them, and if you're a facility that is a waste manager or plastic waste recycler, you will likely have to report to the Federal Plastics Registry. Now, there are some exceptions. For example, Mike, go to the next slide. They have put some exemptions in place. If you import, manufacture, or place less than 1,000 kilograms of plastics per year on the Canadian market, then you are exempt from reporting to the Plastics Registry. This exemption exists just to avoid creating heavy administrative burdens on very small plastic producers. But just for context, 1,000 kilograms of plastic is roughly 40,000 plastic bottles or 200,000 shopping bags. So, most facilities will almost always exceed this threshold. And once we determine whether or not you do meet that threshold, then we can actually move on to reporting for the phase one. So what exactly do you have to report? If you're a facility, you have to provide your entity information. This is just generic administrative details, company information, address, etc. You have to provide product and packaging categories, as well as their weights in kilograms. You have to provide the resin type and the sources of your plastic, whether they're virgin fossil-based, virgin bio-based, post-consumer recycled, or post-industrial recycled. And lastly, and most importantly, you have to provide the calculation methods used so that the reporting is transparent, consistent, and it can be verified by the ministry should they conduct an audit, or maybe a third-party consulting firm. They can determine and make sure the calculations are accurate and representative of your facility. So, as Mike mentioned, the phase one reporting deadline is September 29th, 2025. That's less than 2 weeks from now. So the facilities that have to report to phase one is, as we mentioned previously, any facility that imports, manufactures, or places plastic on the market in Canada, and it has to follow along in these three categories. What what the government is focusing in on phase one is household residential waste streams. So anything a consumer would purchase and dispose of in their blue bin or their garbage bin, those are the three categories that are included in phase one. So plastic packaging is the first category, both filled and unfilled. So this includes things like plastic bags, wrappers around foods, plastic bottles, plastic films, containers, electronic and electrical equipment. These are the plastic parts or the plastic components of electronic devices sold for home or residential use. So, for example, if you're going to be buying the new iPhone coming out soon, it's any of the plastics involved with that product, either within the iPhone or the packaging materials that it came in. That would count as electronic and electrical equipment. And single-use plastic or disposable products, that's the third category. That's probably the one we're most familiar with. Single-use plastic cutlery, plastic straws, plates, cups, disposable food service items, etc. So those are the three categories that are included in the phase one reporting. And as I mentioned before, they're really just focusing on the residential waste stream just to gradually phase in the reporting. It's a little simpler. There's less items to look at. There's less calculations for industries to perform. So what's not included in phase one is any plastic that's destined for the industrial, commercial, or institutional waste streams or for construction. So the key takeaway in phase one is your reporting obligations are limited to consumer facing products. You don't need to track any of your industrial plastics or raw resins yet. Now for phase two, that's going to be due in September 2026 for next year. And that uses the 2025 data, which is data collected this year. So in phase two, they're expanding it beyond household plastics. We're now going into the industrial, commercial, institutional, construction, and transportation. And just some examples of industrial, these are factories, manufacturing, or warehouses. And plastics that they typically use, stretch wrap and pallet wrapping, plastic straps, plastic drums, buckets, and totes. Commercial facilities includes retail, restaurants, and offices. They're using plastic office supplies, plastic signage in the shopping malls, things of that nature. We've got institutional, so schools, hospitals, government buildings. This includes medical plastics, cafeteria plastics, cleaning supplies, and it also expands it into construction. So PVC pipes, foam, insulation, as well as transportation industry, uh, tires. If you're doing plastic components like car bumpers, those are all plastic, and those are all included as part of the phase two reporting. So the phase two reporting, it expands on the types of plastics that must be registered. It also kind of expands on the amount of detail that have to be provided for the plastics. And this includes the quantity of plastic wastes generated at the facility, where the plastic goes, whether it's diverted to landfill, does it get recycled, or does it get disposed? So there's a little bit of more information that's required for phase two. But for now, we're going to focus on phase one as that deadline is soon approaching in a few weeks. And I'm going to pass it on now to Mike to go over the plastics registry screening tool.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So the screening tool was created based on a decision tree that's listed in Environment Canada's notice on phase one reporting. So it is only limited to phase one. And again, we'll double down and triple down on the fact that we're only concerned with the residential waste stream. But basically, we thought, it's a lot more straightforward when you have something a little bit more streamlined, as this tool is, with some yes and no answers. And the most important thing at this point, if we're a little late in the game, if your facility or company hasn't really looked into this, I would say feel free to reach out to myself and I can provide you with the screening tool to at least identify, if you are required to report to phase one. If you are not, it does not mean that you may not be required to report in subsequent phases. But I think given that the deadline for that is September 29th, I would prioritize that first. If you're in the category where you are not required to report in phase one, it probably is a good circumstance where, seeing as phase two is a year later, my recommendation based on that would be, talk with stakeholders internally at your facility to make sure that you're using this opportunity, this runway, to really plan out, okay, what kind of information do we need to track in order to be able to report in phase two, three, or four in the future? Do you have the proper metrics or tracking mechanisms to obtain metrics to be able to report in those subsequent phases? So if you're in that category, it's good because you do have the time. But I would say quite quickly, we're going to get, these years pass quite fast, and you're going to get to a circumstance where you're going to need to report. So I wouldn't just sit on your hands if you're in that category. And so with that, I'm going to do just a brief little demo of the screening tool. So hopefully everyone can see. It's a very straightforward Excel data sheet that we created. And I would say the most important things here, two tabs listed for this data sheet. You've got one tab, which is the definitions tab. Again, this is important for you to be able to answer the questions listed on the screening tool. I did reference, terminology that is used within the regulation, things like placed on the market, marketplace facilitator, so on and so forth. So I'd recommend, if you are using this screening tool, step one is probably familiarize yourself with these definitions on the second tab. And then if we refer to the first tab, column C, we've implemented a drop down where, again, yes or no answers. So let's say the first question here, are the packaging and products you manufacture, import, or place on the market included in the product categories of packaging, electronic or electrical equipment, or single-use and disposable products? For argument's sake, let's say yes. You'll see that the next column, which shows the next steps, will direct you to the next question you need to answer, and so on and so forth. So this screening tool is really designed for you to get to a point where you're going to have an answer that provides you a response, so do I need to report to phase one or not? Once you hit that answer, whether it's, you are obligated to report to the Federal Plastics Registry, as you can see in this example, or the opposite would be you're not obligated to report, and that would show up in green. You're no longer required to fill out or answer any of the additional questions that we have listed here. Just like if you answered yes for this, you would again proceed until you get to one of those notifications. So one thing I will recommend, if you haven't already gone through this, if you're still in the circumstance where you're unsure, because it is a new regulation for everyone, you're unsure of some of the definitions, I think this is a great tool. So please reach out to myself, and I can provide you with this screening tool to assist. One of the things we have been telling our clients is, even if you know that you're not required from completing the screening tool, it's a good idea to have a copy of that saved. As again, this is only applicable to phase one reporting. And as the subsequent phases have shown, the fields and requirements will open up for more companies within Canada. So it's highly likely that most companies will be required to report at some point. And I'll pass it back to Tim, who will review the next steps.
Thanks, Mike. So, what should companies do now? I know it's kind of late in the game, but there's still some time. We would recommend filling out the screening tool, what Mike just showed, and we can provide a copy if you'd like to have that. And if it says that you have to report for phase one, you can reach out to Mike or myself, and we can help you with the next steps. If you are reportable, you will need to start collecting information on the plastics. Some information examples are the categories, whether it's electronics, single use, or plastic packaging, the resin type and the source, the quantity imported, manufactured, and placed on the market, and the quantification methods. So there's a lot of information that has to be collected. You may likely have to engage with your suppliers to gather data on the resin types and the content of the plastics. You may have to be setting up internal systems to track and verify plastics data moving forward. And finally, we should plan to meet the first reporting deadline, which is, again, September 29th, 2025. There are ways to request for extensions through the ministry, and we can help you through that process if that's something you'd like us to be involved with. But essentially, it involves drafting a letter to the ministry with the company information, as well as some details and the reason for the request for extension. But generally speaking, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, we've requested for some extensions previously. Did they give it to us, or?
Yeah, so actually, further to what Tim just mentioned there, I did get a response back for one of my clients that had requested an extension to the deadline, as they were having some challenges, I would say, getting data from vendors of theirs. There is a mechanism where you can request an extension, but I will say that the response we got from Environment Canada is just very specific as to the rationale that needs to be included and what would qualify for an extension. So I would say that it's typically going to be viewed as a case-by-case approach on Environment Canada's end on whether or not they will approve an extension. Given that we do have this response, I do have the categories that they will review. So obviously, if it does not fit one of those categories, and I don't think you'll have any luck in requesting one, but that's the way you should structure it. I think if we just look bigger picture, the whole goal of this for Environment Canada is to obtain data, right? That's the end goal for them. They want that data to inform future policies on how to reduce plastic waste. And so I think generally speaking, when we look at requesting deadlines for reporting obligations that are mandatory like this, the best course of action, if you are going about this, is to show whichever regulatory body, in this case, Environment Canada, that you are doing your part. You are actively obtaining, requesting the data, and maybe it's simply some delays from vendors or other stakeholders that you need to reach out to, but you're in the process of doing this. I think, on those grounds or that basis, you're probably more likely, because if it's between them not receiving the data or receiving the data late, I think that's generally going to be their preference. But I will just circle back to the enforcement slide that we talked about earlier. These fines that they have listed in there are quite substantial. So I know in Tim and my experience with many different reporting obligations over the years, sometimes they've been less stringent on enforcement. They are quite particular and have outlined the exact dollar amounts for fines and the rationale for all of this. So, best case scenario I would say is do your best to try to meet any of the deadlines listed, even if it's not phase 1, phase 2, and so on and so forth. That's always the best course of action. If not, I'd say plan B would be to make sure that you follow the guidelines and the extension requests, which again, we can provide upon request to any of you. And you'll probably have a higher likelihood of obtaining an extension. And with that, so I will just mention, this is part 1 of our webinar series on this topic. It's really designed to provide just a general background on phase 1, on the goal of the regulation from Environment Canada's standpoint, and really the role of Pinchin and how we can assist you to complete this. Phase 2 reporting, as Tim mentioned, will be the following September, so September of 2026. We should have a lot more data and experience, obviously, from completing phase 1 submissions to inform us and I would say improve the process with respect to submissions for future phases. So with that, I will open it up to any questions. Tim, I'm not sure if anyone has typed any questions in the chat. Maybe if you can have a look there. As I mentioned earlier, if you do have a question and you did not type it into the chat, everyone was muted when dialing on to the webinar. So if you would like to verbally ask the question, please unmute yourself and you can ask it now.
There is one question from Hiro. If a Canadian manufacturing company exports 90% of its products and sells only 10% within Canada, should the reporting cover only the 10% sold domestically? So the short answer is no. Producers are not required to report on plastic products that they export. So it's really just what is sold in Canada.
Thanks for that, Tim. Are there any other questions, any comments anyone has? Okay, I'll just kind of summarize this as I mentioned before. We are close to that phase 1 reporting deadline. If you are in a circumstance where you have not looked into this and you need our assistance, feel free, please reach out to myself or Tim. I think the first step would be, complete the screening tool for phase 1 to identify if you report or not. And then based on those results, if you are reporting to phase 1, probably good recommendation to submit an extension request. Again, we can guide you through that process, given that we have the insights for the parameters of what an extension should look like in order to be given an opportunity to be awarded by Environment Canada. So we would recommend that. And then if you're in that final category where you've gone through internally, you've reviewed, you're not required to report to phase 1, I do recommend taking the time that you have now between now and phase 2, September of 2026. Make sure that you're discussing internally with all of the relevant stakeholders at your company to ensure, A, do we have the proper processes in place to track this information? And if not, it gives you an opportunity to create those processes internally. That will really simplify the actual reporting process whether your facility reports in phase 2, 3, or 4, or multiple, reporting phases. So I would recommend that you establish those processes so you can identify the metrics. And, if there's any special cases or things that pop up between now and reporting for phase 1 or 2, like I said, please reach out to Tim or myself. I believe part 2 of this webinar series, we're probably going to aim to have another presentation, I would say, in the spring. So we'll be issuing invites and notifications on part 2 of this webinar series. And I just want to thank everyone for attending, and I wish you a good rest of your day and week. Thanks very much.
Thank you.